Hello and welcome to Ratio Christi Television. What you should know about jihad and terrorism is what we're talking about in this episode with my next guest. Ratio Christi is a campus apologetics alliance. We set up Christian apologetics clubs on university, college, community college, and high school campuses as well. Ratio Christi started because of this 50 to 80% fall away rate of church-going youth who leave the church after high school by the time they're 22 years old. So a few years ago, we started Ratio Christi College Prep, where we now prepare high school students for what they will face in college once they get there. Just go to ratiochristi.org, go up to the top, click on RCCP or Ratio Christi College Prep to find out more about that, how you can start a club in your area, become a mentor, and all of that. The purpose of our organization is to help make people aware of the evidence for the Christian worldview and to point people to truth with a capital T, which is why we call our program Truth Matters. Joining me is Dr. Kathryn V. Camp. She is the founder and director of Living Into the Truth Ministries, a division of Kathryn Camp Ministries, LLC. Living in the Truth Ministries is a Christian apologetics ministry based on the promises of Jesus that if we abide by his word, he will live in us just as he lives in the Father, according to John 14, verses 15 through 20. Her ministry offers people a realistic look at how the westernized culture has managed to create a mirage and a distortion of what it looks like to be a Christian. Her website is livingintothetruth.org, and it's a blessing to have her here back on Ratio Christi's Truth Matters. Welcome back, Dr. Camp.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We're here talking about a timely topic. This is a topic that people are always talking about. It always shows up in the media every single week. There's some kind of story that comes out talking about these topics that are intertwined about jihad and terrorism. But what is the difference between jihad and terrorism?
Well, Tony, a lot of people do see these as the same, but they're not. First, defining jihad, it's holy war. And jihad is like a struggle, a striving, or a great effort. There are two types of jihad in Islam. There's the greater jihad, which is the struggle of the soul to overcome the sinful obstacles that keep a person from God. There, in the Quran, you see jihad is nearly always followed by in the way of God. Then there's the lesser jihad, the outward struggle for the welfare of humanity, okay, that stems from the greater jihad, that Islam sees these inseparable from the outward struggle. The lesser jihad is exhibited as any exertion against oppression and tyranny. So what is terrorism? Okay, distinguishing it from other forms of violence is pretty important for us to understand. You can associate it with psychological and spiritual warfare. Terrorism is aimed at unsuspecting non-combatants. It instills fear into the targeted audience and its victims in a dramatic way. Terrorism is basically an act or a threat of violence against unsuspecting individuals with the objective of exacting revenge, fear, and intimidation, or otherwise attempting to influence the pattern of behavior of the victims or their sympathetic audience and change the course of their political, economic, or spiritual destiny.
Now, when we talk about jihad and terrorism, and a jihadist, who is the person who goes and commits that act of terrorism, different people can be called a jihadist. Different people can be called a terrorist. But the thing is that so often, people don't define their terms. But when we're talking about a jihadist, someone who obviously is going to be a follower of Islam and practice jihad in whatever form they're going to be practicing that, what is the psychological profile of a jihadist?
Well, Tony, developing a single profile for an Islamic jihadist today is nearly impossible. However, the recruitment is much the same as recruiting gang members, and this is where our psychological profiles come in. They're usually young, they're immature people, There is a pressure to work to support their family. They don't really have a social safety net. So they look for people who do not have this safety net of family or money. They seek refuge in Allah. They're seeking also rewards for their family, which will also gain them high esteem. And they're promised entry into paradise.
So we talk about jihad, we talk about terrorism, and of course, a terrorist act can be committed by someone who's not a Muslim, who isn't a jihadist. But someone who is a jihadist, in the way that we usually use that term, is someone who's doing a violent act. Like you say, okay, this Muslim over here is praying 5 times a day. Usually he's not called a jihadist. A jihadist is usually used for someone who's out there doing some type of warfare or violence in some way. What are the two, or how are these two, jihad and terrorism specifically, how are those connected though?
Okay, that's a good question. We don't hear very much about the greater jihad, which addresses the inner man. But we hear the terrorism connected with jihadists. We're all jihadists if we're praying and we're seeking that inner soul. But it's also good for Islamists if they can take advantage of the average person's ignorance and separate themselves from the Muslims that take the Quran seriously from the average nominal Muslim. Meaning, we hear about the lesser jihad more often than we hear about the greater jihad. And the average person doesn't even know that there's a difference. They feel like jihad is all terrorist type of actions. However, this greater jihad, if someone starts to take it very seriously, then it becomes the lesser jihad. So that's why they're almost indistinguishable as far as what jihad really is. They see it as terrorist acts.
And when we study the life of Muhammad and the history of Islamic expansion, although these two different types of jihad, quote unquote, were talked about, 90% of the time, if not more, we see that when the term jihad is used and we study Islamic expansion, well, obviously it's pointing to outward fighting. And this inward struggle is the type of jihad, quote unquote, that is fed to people in the West who are ill-informed about the religion of Islam itself, the life of Muhammad, Islamic expansion, and what's happened in the last 1,400 years. But why are people who are at one time peaceful, quote unquote, and peaceful in the Western sense of the word, like peace and tranquility,
right,
peaceful Muslims becoming jihadists? What's going on here?
Well, some of them are appealing to just war. And if you've never heard that term before, the audience, this is the justification of war that would be acceptable to Allah. Okay, in other words, the cause must be a just cause to right a wrong. And it must be undertaken by a legitimate authority, strengthening responsible political order. Okay, the consequences of going to war must also be better than not going to war. So there has to be also a reasonable expectation of victory. So let's consider what just war means. When you are doing something for God or Allah, you can justify just about anything. And this is what's happening with these Muslims who are, as you said very well, Tony, they're peaceful Muslims all of a sudden turning to jihadists. First of all, I'm glad you delineated that, because peaceful in the term of Islam doesn't mean peaceful in the way that we would say shalom to somebody. There will be peace for a Muslim or for the world in their view when everyone submits to Allah.
And this is something that many people in the West have no idea about, that when the early jurists who codified Sharia, the 4 major schools of Sharia, they divided the world into 2 abodes, the house of war, the Dar al-Harb, and the house of peace, the Dar al-Islam. And they said, hey, jihad is unending until the whole world is under under Sharia or Dar al-Islam. So, Kathryn, you know that so many people don't never define their terms, and how important is that when it comes to the different man-made religions out there, specifically Islam, and we're using these different terms like, oh, we want peace. Well, what do you mean by peace? Because this peace and tranquility in a Western sense and a whole world under Sharia type of peace are much different. And if jihad is the means to bring about that Islamic peace, well, people need to be educated about that, and of course about this topic in general. Now, when we are talking about jihadists specifically, why are they willing to resort to violence when so many other, even, devout Muslims who you would say, hey, this person's devout, they're, wearing a head covering, they're praying 5 times a day, they've made a trip to Mecca once or maybe more than once, they're following the 5 pillars. So why do some people just say, well, I'm just going to, follow the 5 pillars? We have other people who take up the sword, or they take up whatever weapon they want to use in order to be jihadists, quote unquote.
Okay, good question. We have a split here. Now, some Muslims claim that the call for violence in the Quran was for only a specific time in history. They justified that when Muhammad was persecuted in Mecca for the first 13 years of his ministry, that he was later justified in killing for the last 10 years of his ministry. And it was necessary to build the Islamic movement. Unfortunately, in the Quran, there is no time limitation on the passages listed and calling for this lesser jihad, so to speak. So that's why you have some deciding to go ahead and usher in the new kingdom. That's another thing. They feel like they can make it come quicker by taking up arms and acting out in the terrorist violences that we see today.
So it basically comes down to patience. Are you a patient person or are you an impatient person? And how quickly do you want to see this revolution? How quickly do you want to see the world come under Sharia? Now, of course, Muslims are people made in the image of God. We need to love them because of that fact. We need to share the gospel with Muslims and let them know why Islam is false and why the Jesus of the New Testament is so much greater than the Islamic Isa of the Quran. And we talk about, again, peace. People say, oh, Islam is a religion of peace, when Islam doesn't mean peace, it means submission. A Muslim is one who submits. And at the same time, here in the West, you always hear this, oh, Islam means peace, Islam is a religion of peace, and all of that. Now, of course, as we talked about earlier, it's very important to define your terms. What do you mean by peace? I wish every person asked that question whenever this claim was made. But please go a little bit more in depth into this, of this supposed claim that Islam is a religion of peace.
Right. Well, just like there are Christian apologists, there are Muslim apologists. And Muslim apologists claim that jihad is allowed under 2 conditions. One is self-defense, and the other is fighting against oppression. The problem here that lies is the definition of self-defense and the definition of oppression. For instance, if a nation's rulers do not recognize the rule of Islam, they qualify as oppressors, making them a legitimate target for war. Also, many Muslims see America as an aggressor because of how broadly it distributes its Hollywood films and propaganda. Therefore, it justifies their hatred and aggression towards us as self-defense.
Now, we hear oppression is a bad thing, and of course, people shouldn't be oppressed, and of course, murder is wrong as well. Now, many people don't read the primary sources of Islam. They don't read the Quran, which is supposedly an eternal book that was sent down to Muhammad through the angel Jibreel or Gabriel. They don't read the Hadith, which are the things that Muhammad said and did and approved and disapproved of. They don't read the Sirah literature, which are the biographies of Muhammad. Now, also too, for anyone who has read the Quran, sometimes they say, Kathryn, "Oh yeah, I read the Quran. Near the beginning, it was kind of violent and stuff, but then as I got near the end, then all of a sudden it was like more peaceful and that kind of thing." But they don't know that the Quran isn't laid out in chronological order. It's pretty much longest chapter to shortest chapter, and chronologically, it was almost the other way. It was flipped because the shorter, less aggressive chapters came earlier in Muhammad's life when he didn't have power, he didn't have followers, he wasn't a military leader at that point. And the longer, more aggressive, more detailed chapters were later in life. And chapter 2, which is all over the place as far as topics, is one of the later revelations that were received. And in Surah 2, or chapter 2, it actually says that oppression is worse than killing. So for a Muslim to feel oppressed, well, then to go and kill the person who's oppressing them, that's actually seen as a better thing than just staying under oppression. And of course, people who aren't reading this stuff, who don't get the context of it, they're not getting this information. And it's so important for people to get that information, to get informed about Islam, but then love your Muslim neighbors at the same time. Don't let them define Islam, because they don't. Muhammad did 1,400 years ago. But love them enough to get the truth to them, let them know about the true Jesus and all of that. Now, what is the jihadist reference in the Quran in order to justify behavior, or this type of behavior?
Right. Well, as you know, Tony, it's all over the place. And I thought I would give a few because people frequently ask me, where is it in the Quran? So let me pick out a few verses. Obviously, we don't have time to go through all of them. But let's see. Let's do Surah 2, like you mentioned earlier, 2 verses 216, which would be 216. Fighting is prescribed for you, and ye dislike it. But it is possible that ye dislike a thing which is good for you, and that you love a thing which is bad for you. But God knoweth, and ye know not. Then we can go to Surah 4, 74 and 75. Let those fight in the name of Allah and sell the life of this world for the hereafter. To him who fighteth in the cause of Allah, whether he is slain or gets victory, soon shall we give him reward of great value. Those who believe fight in the cause of Allah, and those who reject faith fight in the cause of evil. So fight ye against the friends of Satan. Feeble indeed is the cunning of Satan. And then, let's see, we can go to Surah 47, 4. Therefore, when ye meet the unbelievers, smite at their necks at length. When ye have thoroughly subdued them, bind a bond firmly on them. But if it had been Allah's will, he could certainly have exacted retribution for them himself. But he lets you fight in order to test you, some with others. And then it says, but those who are slain in the way of Allah, he will never let their deeds be lost. So there's certainly an encouragement to fight and to kill those who do not submit to Allah or believe in the ways of Islam.
Now, when Muhammad died, it wasn't like he had told his followers, or right before he died, I should say, okay, mission accomplished, we're good now. Don't do what I told you to do anymore. We're exactly where we need to be. He ended up dying, and his followers went out and did what he said to do. Now, here's the thing, Kathryn, is that some people they'll look at these verses and say, well, that was in that context during that time period. That doesn't apply to people today or anything like that. But the thing is that we need to look and see what his earliest followers did. After he died, it's not like Islam discontinued at that point or that it didn't spread anymore. I mean, it spread over the next hundreds of years, way out, east, west, every single direction. People need to see the maps of Islamic expansion. That wasn't defensive fighting, quote unquote, as some people try to claim. His followers went out and did what he said to do. Now, some people will say, well, all non-Muslims are supposed to be killed, or they'll ask, hey, is that true? What do you usually tell people when they haven't read the Quran, but they hear these different things, and they take these things which may seem extreme to them, and they're like, oh, this can't be true. I mean, this can't actually be, a command or whatever. But that one specifically, how do you respond to that?
The question is whether the Quran teaches Muslims should kill all non-Muslims. Is that right, Tony?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. It does say that. And I know that this is never broadcast. People will never see this on the mainstream media. But there are several passages there, too. For instance, Surah 551, it says, no Christians or Jews. There's also Surah 476, fight those who do not believe in the cause. Surah 61, Muhammad's call to hostility toward non-believers. Surah 839, fight until the non-believer submits. Surah 9:5, kill all unbelievers. It's pretty clear what their marching orders are if they go by the Quran.
And this is just the Quran that you're talking about. I mean, we're not even including, hadith narrations, which are the things that Muhammad had said, which aren't as at the same level as the Quran, again, because the Quran's supposedly an eternal book. But the hadith are seen way up there, and the hadith is how you interpret the Quran and vice versa. And, we see in there these commands to go out and fight. Now, Kathryn, as you know, and as I know, and as many Christians know, and as many non-Christians hopefully realize, it's a good thing that many Muslims don't do what Muhammad said to do. And we obviously don't want to point them to these sources and say, hey, you need to become more like Muhammad. No, you don't want to, you don't want to do that. You want to just meet them wherever they're at and point them to the gospel from there. But at the same time, your Western, Muslim who loves America, loves the Constitution, loves the Bill of Rights, they don't define Islam. And too many people in the West are allowing their Muslim neighbor or coworker or friend or classmate to define Islam when they don't. Muhammad did 1,400 years ago. Just like if someone wants to know about Christianity, say, well, my neighbor Bob is a Christian. Maybe you need to go and talk to him and learn what you need to do. Well, no, just read the words of Jesus in the New Testament. Read the New Testament as a whole, because Jesus defines Christianity just as Muhammad defines Islam. So people need to be educated about all this stuff. Is Islam tolerant of other religions?
Definitely not, Tony. It's very clear in the Quran, even from what we just pointed out, and in just the Quran, that killing all non-believers, that means non-believers towards Islam. In fact, you may know where this is, but there is a surah in the Quran that says that when Isa, meaning Jesus, comes back, he will break the cross and kill the pigs meaning the Jewish people, and the cross meaning Christians. And that way, anyone who continues to believe in the Judeo-Christian God will be done away with by Christ himself. So no, they are not tolerant of other religions at all. They just kind of are very patient in biding their time.
And also, too, what people don't realize is that, many Muslims will say, oh, I love Jesus. They'll they know exactly who you're talking about, or at least it sounds like it when you mention Jesus. They'll say, we revere Jesus. We love Jesus. Jesus is a prophet. But the thing is that they don't believe that Jesus died on a cross. They don't believe that he's the eternal Son of God incarnate in human flesh. They don't believe that he is coming back and judging the living and the dead in the sense of what we read in the New Testament. No, the Isa, quote unquote, of the Quran is coming back to destroy Christianity, as you said, breaking the cross, killing the pigs. This isn't the historical Jesus. This isn't the Jesus who actually walked this earth, and other non-Islamic sources would not agree with this either. This is something that people need to realize. If you look outside of the Quran, if you look outside of any Islamic source, primary, secondary, whatever, no non-Islamic source lines up with the Islamic worldview. You can look at Jewish sources, pagan sources, Roman sources, etc. Nothing lines up with the Islamic worldview. It's the Jesus of Nazareth who we need to point Muslims to. And Kathryn, it's a blessing to have you here to inform people as we encourage them to share the gospel with people, including Muslims. They need the gospel. Muslims are victims of the greatest lie called Islam, and they need the truth. Now, Kathryn, you and I both know that Muslims are very devout people, and it's been said that many times ex-Muslims make the best Christians, because when they realize that Islam is a lie and they repent and put their trust in Jesus Christ, well, then they're even more devout for the truth when they know it's the truth, even more so than they were for a lie previously. It's been a blessing to have you here, and I want to point people to your website as well to get more information about you and your work. Thank you so much for being here and talking about jihad and terrorism. Always timely topic.
It's a pleasure and an honor, Tony. Thank you so much.
Friends, when we look at the available evidence, we find that the Christian worldview aligns with reality. We need to think about our need for a Savior, and salvation is found only in the Lord Jesus Christ. Again, the true Jesus of Nazareth, who died on a cross and who rose from the dead 3 days later in glory, who didn't evade death like the Islamic Jesus or Isa, but actually conquered death. Which one is greater, evading death and not being killed, or conquering death and having power over the grave? Because that is what Jesus had. He rose from the dead 3 days later. This is the true Jesus who Muslims need to hear about. We want to encourage you to love the Muslims around you and get the gospel to them. That's what they need. They need the gospel. They know that this universe doesn't make sense without a creator, so point them to the right creator and the right Jesus. And remember, when it comes to what we believe and why we believe it, truth matters.